Hi, my name is Matthew Belisario, and this is Greg Hendrick, and here we are on the Belisario Sonic YouTube channel doing another edition of Jazz Nerds. And today, back down in New Orleans, the last episode we did, we talked about New Orleans as kind of the melting pot of jazz and kind of
the birthplace, the cradle where it all began.
And so we thought that today would be a good time to go over the biggest influence probably that we know of out of New Orleans. And that's Louis Armstrong. So we're going to talk about him today.
From New Orleans, but also I would say probably the most well-known figure of jazz, I'd say, is Louis. You go to Paris, people know his songs. People know Miles. But everywhere you go, everybody knows and loves Louis Armstrong.
Yeah, for the most part, he has his critics.
He does have his critics,
talk a little bit about that.
And we'll get into that. But for the most part, people who listen to Louis love it.
Yeah.
So let's begin with the early days. Louis Daniel Armstrong was born in 1901, but not according to him. He always said he was born on July 4th, 1900. And I think, as they say, close enough for jazz, right? But
a little bit of myth making there. And
Right. But he was born into poverty. And his dad left at an early age, so he was raised by his mom in a place called the Battlefield, which at the time was a really rough neighborhood in New Orleans, south of Rampart near Storyville. But that's where he was raised. And they were basically, back then they didn't have welfare. So they were on the brink of homelessness throughout his early years. And for a couple of years, he went and lived with his grandma. Then he went back with his mom. And the most significant thing that happened in those early years, I would say, was he started working, him and his sister and mom started working for this family. The Kovnikovs, do we have that?
It's a Jewish family.
A Jewish family from Lithuania. Yeah, but they really took Louis under their wing. They knew they were very poor, so they'd feed him, and they also encouraged music. They encouraged singing around the home, like the Russian lullaby. I guess he'd sing that to one of their children, and he even credits that for where he developed his personality, his joy of singing back in those early years with that family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he does. Yeah, he credits that. Sure does. And then started playing on riverboats.
Yes, yeah. He
started.
Right. He started playing with riverboats. I should say, before that happened, something very significant happened. He stole his stepfather's gun. He fires a blank into the air, and at 12 years old, he's arrested and thrown into jail.
Yeah.
So after that, his sentence is he has to go to juvie hall, which at the time they called the colored waif. And it was like an all-black juvie hall run by this guy, Captain Jones. And he was pretty harsh. Like, he used to beat those kids. And they were served bread, water, and molasses, no mattress to sleep on. It was a rough 2 years for the young Louis. But Captain Jones was friends with this guy, Pete Davis. And he ran the juvie band.
That's where he got his training, right?
Yeah, so he got his first cornet from the Lithuanian family, and so he fiddled around on it. But it wasn't until he was in juvie and this band leader said, you know what, he's pretty good, and so he offered him a spot in his band. And through performances with that band, that's when King Oliver and Kid Ory noticed Louis playing for the first time. Like, there's a real talent here. And so those formative years were important for him. And of course, once he got out of juvie 2 years later, he was back in what's the neighborhood, that rough place we said, the Battlefield, right?
Right.
He's back in the Battlefield. He started doing some gigs around there,
and then onto the
riverboats,
where he played with Fate Maribel, which supposedly he got a lot of experience and musical training from him.
Yeah, right. He learned to sight read. That was the critical thing at those years. And he learned a lot of the standards of the day, so his repertoire was expanded by playing on these riverboats.
So that was his university.
Yes, that's
That
right.
was-
That's
how
absolutely
he-
it. Yep.
Yep. So then he goes along with King Oliver, which of course was one of the main figures.
Right.
And I think probably still one of those figures that's not known that well, because Louis went into his band and then kind of became the big name after that and really remained very popular throughout his whole career.
Right. So, what's interesting about that relationship with King Oliver, he took him up to Chicago.
Right.
Louis was probably 18, 19 at the time. So this young kid leaving New Orleans, going up to Chicago, which at the time, Chicago somewhat replaced New Orleans as the center of jazz in those
Chicago
years.
and then New York.
And then New York, yeah. So he was hitting the major, meccas, the centers of jazz. In New York, I believe he started playing for Fletcher Henderson,
Yep.
that orchestra. Now, yes, so those were productive years, but he was still playing like second horn, right? He hadn't really stepped into the limelight yet.
1924, he goes parts with King Oliver. He starts his recording career around 1923. He actually is a sideman, just recording.
Yes,
records all the way until 1969.
Huge. Let me say a quick
a long-
point about that first recording, because this is fascinating. So from Chicago, they went down to Indiana, and they did an album. They did a record before there were electric recording devices. So Louis was playing into this giant tunnel, and the
big
sound
horn.
waves would then register on the record.
Right.
There was no electricity involved.
Literally cutting the wax.
Literally
on a cylinder.
cutting the wax. So Louis was playing his horn, and he was so loud, King Oliver had to stand 15 feet back from Louis Louis had to stand 15 feet back so the sound would be balanced. But that goes to show just how powerful
Of a player.
he was back then.
And what they had to deal with recording back then.
Yeah.
They literally had to shuffle people around the studio during the performance when one soloist would come up and then someone else would step back and they'd move around and shuffle around. So it was pretty incredible.
That is amazing. When did electric recording start? A few years later, Matt?
I would want to say in the 20s. So I
20s,
think when
yeah,
you get around to the Hot Fives, 1925, which I think this was recorded in Chicago, then you're here at 1925, and this is going to be really his first main influential recording on his own.
Classic album, yeah. And
Which-
Kid Ory's on that,
Yes.
isn't he? Trombone?
Absolutely. Yeah, Kid Ory's on it.
Yeah.
Basically, you had the Hot Five is Kid Ory on trombone, Johnny Dodds is on clarinet, Johnny Sire on banjo, and then you have Armstrong on piano. There was no drummer until they went to the Hot Sevens a couple years later. And then you would get your Hot Sevens, which added in that drummer and a tuba player.
Was
for
it?
your-
Yes. On the Hot Five, is that Heebie-Jeebies? Because
Hot Fives.
that's somewhat of a significant
Yeah,
song.
that's
yeah,
right.
the
With the
Heebie-Jeebies.
scatting.
That introduced the world to scatting. It had been done before,
Right.
But this somewhat made it known to the public. People weren't familiar with scatting before Heebie-Jeebies.
Right.
It's a good one.
So then he goes to Harlem, starts working there. Connie's in Harlem, which was a rival to the Cotton Club in New York. And there was a venue where they had a pretty elaborate stage show and kind of lively entertainment, similar to the Cotton Club. So if you've seen the old movie, The Cotton Club, you kind of get an idea
Oh, right,
about
okay.
that.
Yeah, that is a
how
cool
that
thing.
was. But then the 1930s is when the new recording technology comes out for RCA, and you got the RCA ribbon microphone, 1931. So it
Okay,
becomes kind of popular for recording that with that technology.
And what's significant about the ribbon?
That's pretty
recording?
much what would be used all the way up through the 50s.
Oh,
That's
okay.
what you have all the even the 50s rock and rollers use the ribbon microphone, and you get a really unique sound with that.
Yeah.
For the vocals, and not only
heard about
that,
the
it's very
vocals.
directional too, so you don't have to worry about. It's really good for recording in a studio because I can set up a ribbon microphone right in front of the singer, and it does not pick up the things on the side very much. The
Wow.
other instruments
Okay.
around you. So that became a great benefit when you're recording in a studio, that you can get a little bit of isolation more than you would normally get with the other microphones that they had.
Yeah, so somebody like Louis Armstrong, that's a game changer.
Yeah. So then he went to the New Cotton Club in Los Angeles, plays with Lionel Hampton. But then this whole mob thing, which I didn't
Well, yeah,
it kind of ran him out of town.
Well, going back a little earlier to that, in the late 20s, he met an associate of Al Capone's named Joe Glazer. And Glazer would eventually become Louis' manager for the bulk of his career. And so this is a guy who could obviously get the deal done. It was a good thing for Louis.
Get booked and get into the clubs.
Yeah. But what's the mafia story with?
Well, he goes apparently goes to Los Angeles to seek some new opportunities, and then for some reason the mob wanted him out of town. So he went. That's how he ended up back in New Orleans. And so that I don't know the whole story behind that, but yeah,
it forced him out of town, and there was enough to get him out of LA, which is, just on that, it's one of the interesting things about Louis' life is the contrast, right?
Very jovial figure.
Very jovial, very outgoing, yet such a high range on the trumpet with the notes, yet the deep, gravelly, raspy voice that we all know and love. But his life was a bit of a contradiction too. Part of it, when he was in those early years in New Orleans, like he pimped a girl, and she actually stabbed him in the shoulder. So he said, "Okay, I'm out of this. I'm done with that."
Get
right?
out of that business.
He was a man from the streets.
Yeah, and so we can't spend all day going through his whole life, but I wanted to hit on a couple more things where he becomes, in the 40s, he becomes popular, and also he does some big band stuff, which a lot of people kind of neglect to talk about. But then he ends up going to the whole Hello Dolly, where he gets into the popular music, and then everybody started calling him a sellout.
Right, so that happened, Hello Dolly, that happened in the 60s,
64.
right? So he's a bit older in years, right?
He actually beats the Beatles out.
Yes, that's right. It was a number one selling album for that year. Let me ask you real quick, so when the big swing era came about, what did Louis play? He didn't play with like Duke or
no. Played with Earl Hines,
Count Basie, or
played with Earl Hines, some Dixieland musicians. They did a big band, but his most well known for the smaller bands like with Louis Armstrong and his All Stars.
Oh yeah,
which will
that's
be about
right.
5 or 6 different people playing with him. And actually, I've got a record here I want to pull out.
Oh yeah,
quick. I've got a whole bunch of Louis Armstrong records, but this right here was one that was put Grand Rapids.
Yeah.
And you can see who played on there with him. So that was a typical band that he would play with, Louis Armstrong and his All Stars.
Yeah, that's great.
So you got
Edmund Hall, clarinet, Trummy Young, trombone, Billy Kyle, piano, Arville Shaw, bass, Barrett Deems, drums, Velma Middleton, vocals.
And Velma Middleton had been with him quite a long time. If you're familiar with Louis Armstrong, plays W.C. Handy, she sings with him on that as well.
Yeah, one of the best albums of all time. And that's what
favorites.
changed your life, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's what really got you
into jazz.
Got you into jazz.
Yeah, so he goes in 1964. He hadn't been in the studio for a couple of years. He does the whole Hello Dolly thing. Knocks the Beatles off from being number one, from what I understand. And making him number one, he was 62 years old, almost 63.
That's incredible. What a career, that began, the 1920s.
And that would only be 5 years before he dies, right? Oh no, about 6 years. He dies in 71.
Yeah, 71, right.
So he was, a couple other interesting facts. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as an early influence, which I didn't know that.
Yeah, me either. Huh.
He ends up having problems with his heart. But before he dies, he does do all these tours to Africa and to Europe, and they started becoming known as the Ambassador. That's where he kind of got that nickname from.
Right.
And he also got the nickname Satchmo, which a lot of people don't know because they said he had a big mouth.
Yeah, well,
So like a satchel.
Right, a satchel, it meant some money. So in his earlier days when he was performing on street corners, a lot of times people would throw coins, and Louis allegedly would keep them in his mouth, and so satchel mouth, and so that became Satchmo. Yeah.
For short.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he became known, he did some national broadcasts, traveled around Africa and Europe and different places, became kind of known as the ambassador for America regarding jazz music. Now, we're getting a little bit of a controversial topic because a lot of the people that grew up, especially during the early civil rights movement, and Wynton Marsalis talks about this. I'm getting it from these guys. I'm not making this. I wasn't there, obviously, during that time. But
right.
Wynton Marsalis talks about when he's growing up, they were listening to funk, they were listening to blues and to some of the soul music, and then started getting into Freddie Hubbard and Charles Mingus and all these kind of, which was big at the early 60s, the civil rights movement in the 70s as well.
Right.
And so a lot of them, and Wynton Marsalis says this, that a lot of people at that time, the black community, considered him a sellout and called him an Uncle Tom.
Oh, wow.
And that became controversial. And but Wynton said or Dizzy Gillespie kind of got upset about that because he was like, this guy's no Uncle Tom. This guy just suffered a lot. But if you don't know anything about him, Dizzy always said, and I'm going to quote it, he said, what I failed to realize, because even Dizzy kind of had some reservations about him until he met him.
Interesting.
And he said, what I failed to realize is that Louis refused to let anyone take away his joy for life and his joy for music. And he became really good friends. Him and Clark Terry actually moved to where Louis lived and used to go over there and hang out with him all the time.
Nice.
And he would share all these stories and also his technique on trumpet with them.
Yeah.
And Dizzy said, I would have never been able to play if it was not for Louis Armstrong. And he also paved the way for us, because he suffered immensely coming up. A lot of people don't understand how much he suffered for being black and being trying to actually play music.
Yeah. I mean, down in New Orleans at the time, when he grew up, it was totally segregated.
Yeah.
Then
he gets arrested. He was jailed and kicked out of California for smoking cannabis.
Right. That was always a part of his life, though. Throughout the year. Like on that first album, actually, the Hot Five, I think there's a song on there called Muggles. And Muggles, maybe it's. Well,
this is not the complete one either.
Okay.
So,
but anyway, Muggles refers to marijuana because he smoked it frequently.
So then he does this, but Armstrong, when it came to the racial stuff, he was very chose his battles wisely.
Right.
And so there were times where he stood up. So September 1957, 7 months after the bombing attempt in Knoxville, he grew upset when President Eisenhower did not compel Arkansas to allow the 9 students to attend the Little Rock Central High School. And so Pops here, he had leverage and he used it. He spoke out. Armstrong stated publicly that Eisenhower was two-faced, had no guts, told one reporter it's getting so bad that the colored man hasn't got any country. His comments made network newscasts and front pages. The Associated Press reported that State Department officials had conceded that Soviet propagandists would undoubtedly seize on Mr. Armstrong's words.
Oh, wow.
So that's how upset they got at him for speaking out. But he did speak out. But again, he really chose his battles wisely.
Yeah, and I didn't.
He also
know that, so
publicly
that's
boycotted New Orleans. He publicly boycotted New Orleans for banning integrated bands. 1956, he refused to play. So it took until almost 9 years later when the Civil Rights Act, 1964, undid the laws so that you could actually have integrated bands again. So pretty cool as far as him sticking up for this stuff.
That's right.
When he thought that it would do some good, because a lot of people can become bitter and can kind of, and people quit listening to you.
Right.
And so he really, people said he could have done more, but I think
he put his neck out at the most critical time.
Yeah. So on tour in New Orleans, he handed out cash on the street. He bought a radio set for an orphanage where he grew up at. So he did a lot of things like that as well, community work.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people don't realize that he did that. He gave back to the community as well, because he did pretty well for himself, all considering.
Sure.
from his music. Now I want to talk about his musicality though before we close out.
Yeah, that's
because
good.
really that's where the rubber meets the road. We could talk
Right.
about his personality. We didn't know him personally. We can hear stories, secondhand stories,
Yeah.
and about what he should have done or shouldn't have done. But in general, people thought he was a really good guy, jovial guy. But his music, people did not doubt his ability to play the trumpet. Let's
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah. No, that's his ability to improvise was groundbreaking, and on that first
took it to
album,
another level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I believe the song
On-
is
on the
West
End Blues.
End Blues.
Yeah.
Which is, if you play the trumpet, it's on that top 10 list of songs you study and learn by heart. But that's really where it all began, and it was innovative.
Right. So one of the first things when you hear is that he was very melodic. So he was able to improvise on the melody. He was able to improvise on the rhythm as well, in the phrasing, as far as playing over the top. That's what they used to call it, playing over the top of the rhythm.
Okay.
So you could,
Yeah.
And he really kind of started that because a lot of people think that that started with the bebop players, but it really did not. It started with Louis. Now he didn't do it to the extent as those guys did, but he kind of started that idea of this form of improvisation. So when you look at, and I'm getting this from other jazz musicians that say when you transcribe Louis Armstrong's solos and attempt to write them down, you notice that it's difficult to notate the rhythms. This is because his approach to time is astonishingly free and natural. He transcends the rigid structure of time and chord progression of the tune to create new musical ideas. His lines in time are being created organically from the melodic and vocal place rather than a theoretical one. So we can not only examine his trumpet playing, but also this unique vocal style that he played with.
In those early years, he really helped bring swing to the forefront, right?
Right.
Like, because he always described it as, look,
My record's coming to an end.
all right, we'll get something new on.
Keep talking.
We'll take the quarter note, we'll add the half, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. But with Louis, he described it as, we'll add the triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, da 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 da. So that swing style really began. It came out of the whole New Orleans sound, but Louis was a pioneer in developing it.
Right. So you also get the emphasizing of the 7th, the 9th, the 13th, major and 7th chords. What Nicholas Payton said, who was more of a modern trumpet player, but started off playing New Orleans jazz, he says he changed the feel. It's one thing to have your own feel, but it's an entirely different thing to change the conception of what a quarter note feels like. I can't think of anyone in recorded history who's done that, and we're still borrowing his quarter notes, the forward motion and the pulse. That's Nicholas Payton. Wynton Marsalis says, because I think people still kind of think of Pops as his playing is easy.
Right.
He says pop solos sound easy, but they're not. You don't realize how difficult they are until you try to play them. That's Wynton Marsalis.
That's Wynton, yeah.
Another younger trumpet player called Sean Jones says, I had heard that he was just a great entertainer. Again, he kind of grew up thinking that he's just with the white handkerchief and being an entertainer.
Yeah.
He goes, I didn't consider him a great trumpet player until I tried to play what he played, and I couldn't play it. John Faddis, great trumpet player, said, some of his solos on the hot fives and seven still kick our you-know-whats. Listen to how a solo floats above the time and you have the roots of bebop. That's John Faddis. So
it's great quotes.
some of
Matt.
those
are excellent.
yeah. So this guy, and there's a couple other quotes I wanted to
Yeah, those are
quote
rich.
here.
Those are very
Miles
rich.
Davis. You can't play anything on a horn that Louis hasn't played. I mean, even modern. I love his approach to the trumpet. He never sounds bad. Miles Davis. Louis Armstrong, a station in the history of jazz, is unimpeachable. If it weren't for him, there wouldn't be any of us. Dizzy Gillespie.
Dizzy.
He's one of the great geniuses of all time. He changed American music. John Baptiste,
Yeah.
who's another pretty cool modern musician that
jazz
not only plays
performer
jazz, but
out of the
delves
New
into
Orleans
the
style.
other stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that Couple of records I also wanted to share here before we close out. Really cool record, Louis Armstrong at Newport with Eddie Condon. So that's a pretty cool record.
Yeah.
European concert recordings here, Ambassador Satch. Tin Roof Blues on here, Muskrat Ramble. I mean, that's also another thing, are the songs, the tunes that he made popular. Verve's Choice, I got the best up here on Verve. Got a Right to Sing the Blues. All kinds of cool songs on there.
Man, these are priceless.
The great Lewis
Body and
here.
Soul.
Satchmo the Great. Mahogany Hall Stomp. St. Louis Blues.
I mean, the thing about Louis, he had such a great sense of humor, though, didn't he?
Yeah.
Like, he does.
Well, his
songs
music
like
always makes me
Cheesecake.
happy.
Yeah.
The nightclubs, these are newly released. They have not been released before. These have just come out in the last couple of years, and they're limited editions. So these are from the 50s.
And was his last album the country and western
I
album?
don't know what it was.
I
1969
haven't
was the
listened
last
to that,
recorded.
But this is a great song, "Lazy River," and again in that you can hear him start to scat. You got West End Blues on there. This has a lot of good stuff. High Society.
So I recommend these couple of albums because you can still get these. You can go online and pick them up, and they're limited editions and they're live recordings, and they sound pretty good. You know, they're from the 50s. This is Standard Oil session, so you've got Jack Teagarden on trombone, Earl Father Hines on trumpet, and then you got guitar, bass, drums. So again, kind of almost an all-star
Did
lineup
this have
there.
what I think I just saw? Oh yeah, one of my favorite songs of all time. Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans?
I mean, great vocalist. You know,
Yeah, you can't
it was
beat
just
it.
an all-around musician, and really like you know, these guys have said that he is a unique influence on American music. Period.
Right, almost the archetype of American.
And probably the
jazz.
first. I would say the first. Maybe not the first, but one of the first jazz popular stars, if you will.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Is anybody more popular before him? Probably not.
No. Which album would you say cut through? Like, did he have our first song that?
Well,
really,
the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens were what
That
got
was
him
it?
on that was what really. And then maybe I don't know if at the time when they came out they were as cutting edge as they were realized to be. Maybe a little later. You know how that
Yeah,
works. I
yeah.
don't know. But that was what really put him on the map, I think, for those sessions.
That was his first.
And then
big
you know
hit.
the Plays W.C. Handy was also a big record.
Yeah.
So he had such a big recording catalog.
I know. I'm not sure which album it's on, but when he did "Ain't Misbehavin'," that was a big one.
And he did a lot of songs more than once.
He did a lot of those
With other
kind of
people.
show musical songs.
Yeah.
But that was a huge hit for him that he got from Fats Waller.
Right.
He started off in the pit. He was in the orchestra, and everybody was going to these shows saying, you know, the songs are okay, but that one's great. And by the end of the run, Louis was on stage performing it, and then he went and recorded it several months later, I think in 1929, and then it was such a hit. Fats Waller said, you know what, I need to record this and release it. And within that year, something like 24 albums with that recorded that song.
It's incredible.
So everybody started doing what Louis does.
Right.
Yeah. All right, man.
Well, I think we've used up about 30 minutes of your time. So if you're still watching, thanks for sticking
Thanks
with
for
us.
joining us.
And
Yeah.
we'll do another one next week. And go ahead and please subscribe to the channel and
Spread the word.
And also leave comments. We'd love to hear what you have to say. So
Yeah, appreciate you guys. We
you
wouldn't
should
do
probably
this
say that at the beginning
if it wasn't for
because
you.
no one's watching at this point. All right. Take
All
care.
right. God bless.